push it out to Liberty as well. And then notTV, I got lots of windows open. We just went out on notTV as well. There's about 29 people hanging out on the page. So if you guys are able to log in or you got an invite code, you can register for your notTV account. Use the code BC Rising, no spaces. And then you can join the chat on notTV as well.
All right, thanks for that, Travis. So this is brand new tonight, where there's a chat option at notTV. We'll be monitoring the chat for questions on Zoom here and also at notTV. And so I just put that in the chat so you know where to register. We have a capacity for 500. Last time we reached over 1,000, so we were prepared to, if you know of anyone who's trying to get on. So, all right, let's get started. My name is Erica with BC Rising. Lisa and I and Randy, we help guide BC Rising. And we're just honored tonight to be back with you all. So welcome and thank you for joining the UNDRIP and the Threat to Property Rights in Canada webinar number 2. So many of you attended that first UNDRIP webinar on February 29th. And so since then, Lorene Dar and the featured guest speakers have gone through it was over 200 questions that night, and studied those questions for answering them tonight. And with furthermore discussion, and we have another featured guest speaker tonight too, in addition. So we're really fortunate. And so at BC Rising, we strive to offer space for respectful conversations, education, and solutions. So we just hope you have an open mind tonight, and we look forward to your questions and the conversation. And again, we'd like to thank Travis at notTV for live streaming as our audience grows. And donations are appreciated to help all his efforts of many, many hours of offering this independent media and with blockchain technology that is being created for independent artists and creators. And so everyone is muted tonight due to the size of the webinar. So that will seem unique to you, but we'll have a way of doing the questions later. So during the Q&A, you can type your questions into the chat, and we'd like to suggest that we keep the chat for questions just because of the size of the webinar. We have a lot of people registered tonight. And so without any further ado, I'm going to pass it over to you, Lorene, and we look forward to hearing from our featured speakers.
Sounds great. Thank you, Erica. Good evening, everyone. So glad you could join us in the second webinar on UNDRIP and the threat to property rights in Canada. Just a refresher, UNDRIP stands for the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. DRIPA, which stands for the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, is the 2019 legislative act in BC that aims to translate UNDRIP into provincial law. Our first webinar was held 3 months ago on February 29th and was in response to widespread concern over BC Land Act amendments announced by the EB government in the first quarter of 2024. Among other concerns, it was understood these amendments would give power of veto to Aboriginal leaders on the use of public lands. Those proposed amendments were withdrawn for the moment amid what appeared to be an unexpected public outcry. However, we continue to see actions being taken that erode property rights, clarity of rights, and general legal stability. Recently, BC has transferred ownership and jurisdiction of Haida Gwaii from the Crown to the Haida Nation. The EB government insists that this agreement will have no impact on private property or businesses. Also recently, the Pender Harbour Area Residents Association Board has announced it has filed proceedings in BC Supreme Court, citing concerns that DRIPA, again, the BC Legislative Act pertaining to UNDRIP, is beyond the province's constitutional power, and therefore a related order in council that excluded consultation with the Pender Harbour property owner is invalid. There are other developments of note, but I want to get to our featured speakers and let their expertise carry the evening. Tonight, we again have Bruce Pardy, the Executive Director of RightsProbe.org, Professor of Law at Queen's University, and a Senior Fellow at the Fraser Institute. And Joshua Lemmens, an Indigenous elder, a leader in the area of food security, and a men's rights advocate. We've also added a new face to the team, as Erica alluded, Jeffrey Rustand. Jeffrey is a retired lawyer with a career in Constitution and Aboriginal law and substantial work in international rule of law development with the United Nations and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. It is Jeffrey who will be kicking off our presentations tonight. But just before we dive in, I'm going to share some video excerpts that I found quite poignant. The first compilation is from a 2019 Aboriginal Law Conference held in Vancouver. The statements you'll hear are in stark contrast to the EB government assuring folks that there are no major changes coming, nothing to be alarmed about, and that any other messaging is fear-mongering. The second compilation is a news interview with Tim Thielman. Tim Thielman is an experienced Aboriginal law specialist, and in this interview, he shares grave concerns about the direction our governments are taking the concept of reconciliation. So let me share my screen to get this going. Are you seeing my screen?
No, we're not seeing your screen.
Okay. I'm going to start that over. I'm sorry for that. Okay, try it again.
Sure, it's enabled, so.
Still not working? I'm not sure what's happening here.
Okay. Maybe go it. See it's coming
You
now.
see a
Now
big
it is.
black screen now?
Yeah, it's great.
Okay.
It should be called protocol. You need someone to come and do the protocol. We started at Tsleil-Waututh just to say our territory because, well, that's what it is.
And we say unceded because that's really what it is. So acknowledging who we are and acknowledging that we're still here is the bare minimum that you can do.
You need someone to acknowledge whose territory you're on, thank the people.
So it has to be followed by some measure of action.
It's part of our own Indigenous law. It needs to have meaning. It needs to be real. Acknowledge all of us. Indigenous people have done nothing with which they must reconcile. Disadvantaged by the system, by the society, by this world.
That the Musqueam people live on 0.02% of the traditional territory. People say, well, I never did that to you. Why didn't take your land? Why am I suffering? Well, the thing is that people still benefit from the colonialistic practices that happen. How do we put teeth to that, though? Last week, we had legislation presented in the provincial legislature that's trying to enshrine what the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples meant.
It sets up a whole new norm. It's morally binding. We can't say it's legally binding.
The word paradigm shift is used.
So we're not talking small changes. We're talking big changes.
But are you guys trying to get my house? Are you trying to get my parents' house?
We still have title to the land.
That the rightful original title holders of this land are the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh.
But we're going to be pushing it. What kind of mechanism can we place on the BC government
to benefit from that economic prosperity that was taken away from us 150, 200 years ago?
Bill 41, it gave us an open door. Life can and will change, that we are a government.
And I know our chief and council are trying to incorporate that. Not moving fully away from Westminster model of governance.
Put the government on notice. We are a government, but now we'll have a law behind us, so we have the opportunity to create a new tribunal.
In order for the fortunes of Indigenous people to change drastically,
The governments have to cooperate with Indigenous peoples through their own institutions. What kind of a tribunal do we put in place to be recognizing our rights? How are we going to change the laws of British Columbia? I understand over 5,000 laws in BC that we have to change. We are a government. In my head, the Forest Act, the Heritage Conservation Act, the Mines Act, we can go on, but we need to remove any barriers in BC laws. We need money. Access to timber. Is there going to be a change in law that says that we're allowed to half the timber in our territories? One of the first ones I'm sure we're to amend in laws is the Forest Act. You can bet that that's going to be one of our first acts that we want to change. And this is what a lot of people are really upset about right now, that they're worried that First Nations will have the veto power over development, that we won't want any development. I don't think that consent will be given very often, if at all. And First Nations do say no. And they say no for a reason, because we still have title to the land. So we have the opportunity to create a new tribunal. So they want us to wait until the law is passed. I'm going, why bother? I mean, we're doing this now, and we don't have to wait till we change the whole legislative thing, because the whole legislative process, minimum of a year. So we need to change that system of how legislation is drafted. So we're not talking small changes, we're talking big changes. And, I don't know if the BC government recognizes that, but we sure do. Yes, the government gave us money, but it's not enough money. Compensation for sacred sites, for lands taken, there's for relocation, there's all kinds of provisions there. It's going to be overwhelming at the number of compensation claims that there will be. And so I'm hoping that the province is ready for that.
Sure. So this week, the NDP government is about to pass the Haida Title Act. It will recognize, for the first time in history, Haida Aboriginal title over roughly 10,000 square kilometers on Haida Gwaii, and relinquish British Columbia's control over land and resources in that territory. So, what does that mean? Well, it means that every single tenure and permit that was granted without the Haida's consent in the past is now in jeopardy. It means that every home and private property, piece of private property, is now uncertain, because contrary to what the NDP has said repeatedly, the agreement does not clearly protect private property rights. And you don't have to believe me, you don't have to believe John Rustand, the leader of the Conservative Party of BC. Talk to Tom Isaac. He's a nationally renowned Aboriginal law scholar for decades. He's written 12 books. He's been cited by the Supreme Court of Canada. He's written a memo on this agreement and says it does not adequately protect private property. In fact, it has conflicting provisions, which include a recognition of Haida title over fee simple lands. So it's not clear whether in the coming days and years, the Haida will assume title over private property, if they will assume control, if they will change the management. In fact, the agreement does contemplate the deregistering of private property by the Haida, the private property they accumulate through different means. So yeah, there's a lot of concerns about this agreement. And one more I should mention is that, what does it mean when you have Haida leaders taking the place of British Columbia leaders on the island? Well, it means that half of the population who are not members of the Haida Nation will now be ruled by leaders that they do not elect. This is within Canada. UNDRIP was passed in 2007 and then adopted by Canada in 2010. It essentially says that all lands traditionally used, occupied, or otherwise acquired by Indigenous peoples will be returned, or compensation paid in lieu, and that Indigenous laws will be applied on all the lands that Indigenous peoples control. So that's the blueprint from UNDRIP. And then in 2019, the British Columbia government, the NDP government, said we are going to make this domestic law. We're going to make this legally binding in BC. So for the last 5 years, that's what they've been busy doing, is taking this vision of an elite racial minority controlling the lands within British Columbia and applying it across every sector of British Columbian economy and society. Like as I said, I worked for the first dozen years of my career were spent advancing Indigenous rights. It's what I learned at university. It's what my clients wanted. It's what I believed, because I thought, like many people do today, that Indigenous people had lost power in the past. And so the only ethical thing to do today is to give power back to them. But the moral arithmetic isn't actually that simple. You know, it's true that the inhabitants at contact have lost control over those lands to the British and successor governments that we now, recognize as Canada. But it's not that simple, because they also, through this messy process of modernization, have gained the keys to the modern world that we all have. You know, the wheel, the light bulb, the microchip, modern medicine. So this is triple human lifespans from 25 years, which is roughly the average lifespan in hunter-gatherer societies, to 75. So that's not, those things won't be coming back from the Haida in this agreement as the land is returned. And I'm not saying they should be. The point isn't here that we should be tabulating up the debits and the credits of the past. I think that's a fool's errand. I think that that we need to have reconciliation today. You know, there's this notion of reconciliation that's come out of the courts and been popularized in the media, of an unending process that leaves First Nations perpetually aggrieved and everybody else perpetually ashamed. I fundamentally reject that. And I think that we all need to, because it's completely unproductive. I think we need to learn to love and respect each other again as equals, because there's no success found in warring over the balance owed from the distant past. So that's what I believe. I believe that we can have reconciliation today. Every individual British Columbian as equals, standing side by side and walking forwards together towards a more prosperous, more inclusive future for everybody. We're talking about the dispossession and of the public and the dismantling of BC laws across an entire province. How can we not be talking about these things right now?
Okay. As with the last webinar, we'll field as many questions as we can after the presentations. And any that we don't get to will help form the basis of a future webinar. Jeffrey, I give you the floor. Jeffrey, you're muted. There we go.
I will be talking about UNDRIP, and especially the BC legislation DRIPA, and what it means if UNDRIP is implemented in British Columbia. Okay, but first, some intro remarks about UNDRIP as a resolution of the UN General Assembly. It is important, people don't understand this, and I want to emphasize. It is a resolution of the United Nations General Assembly. As such, it has no legal force. It creates no rights. It creates no obligations. Not in international law, not in UN member states, and definitely not in Canada. I just want to make that very, very clear. At the most, it is an aspirational expression of the UN General Assembly. And I'm going to repeat, I will repeat, because I want to make sure this is clear. It creates nothing, no rights anywhere, international law, UN member states, Canada. UNDRIP, however, does have legal status in Canada because we enacted it into our domestic law and legislation. The BC legislature incorporated UNDRIP into BC law with its DRIPA enactment in 2019, which I'll refer to either as DRIPA or BC DRIPA. Now, Parliament incorporated UNDRIP into federal law with its act, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, which came into force in 2021. So UNDRIP's legal status is statutory, and this is important. Without the legislation, UNDRIP and its rights would not have any legal existence. If the DRIPA statutes were repealed, UNDRIP would vanish from our law. So the remedy for this problem is simple, politically very, very, very difficult, but legally simple. And tonight I'm only going to deal with BC DRIPA. And my remarks tonight, I am assuming full implementation of DRIPA because that is what the Victoria says it intends to do. I'm also going to assume in my remarks that the implementation will conform to the Constitution. Slide number 1, please. Section 2 of DRIPA, the purposes of this act are as follows: to affirm the application of the Declaration to the laws of British Columbia. Now, whatever that may mean, DRIPA, its rights, its purposes, they all apply to all BC law. And then the next slide. If you look at the last part of that paragraph, the BC government must take all measures necessary to ensure the laws of British Columbia are consistent with the Declaration. Now, this means they have to amend laws, they have to amend regulations, they have to enact new laws and make new regulations. Just these 2 sections alone, they're going to do something very, very unusual. UNDRIP becomes a major organizing principle of BC law. All other laws must conform to UNDRIP. Now, this is very, very strange. Next slide. Section 8.1, subsection 3 of the Interpretation Act. Every act and regulation must be construed as consistent with the Declaration. Now, this just means that UNDRIP is a ruling standard. The courts must interpret BC laws to accommodate UNDRIP rights and authorities insofar as statutory language allows. Then the next slide also. Now, adding to those what we've already discussed, Section 7 of DRIPA, this just provides the government is going to make agreements with Indigenous governments about essentially co-governments, exercising statutory power of decision jointly. I call that co-governance, and also providing for exercise of the veto power by Indigenous governments. Remember, joint decision-making, call that co-government. Requirement of consent, that's a veto. If one party to an agreement, if that person's consent is needed, that's a veto. You can stop anything that's happening. Now, one way to look at this, okay, take the combination of sections 2 and 3 of DRIPA and section 8.1 of the Interpretation Act, and it makes UNDRIP something like a quasi-constitution in BC law. All other laws orbit UNDRIP and must conform to it. BC laws are skewed toward UNDRIP goals. Co-governance becomes a new governing structure in BC. You heard in one of the first video at the beginning of this, they were mentioning there are 5,000 laws. It might be that many. 5,000 laws need to be changed just to make all the laws of BC conform to UNDRIP. Now, the full effect of what will be achieved and known, we'll know that only after the implementing legislation has been enacted. We don't know how far the BC government is going to go. For example, they have to implement legislation, they have to enact legislation, they have to define and create Indigenous land title, and they have to provide for delineation of borders, ownership, and the transfer of land and resources. We don't know what that's going to be. We have to wait for that legislation. There will be other legislation to create Indigenous government and delegate power, authority, and capacity to that government. What that's going to look like, we don't know yet. In my comments below, I'm going to base it on the wording of UNDRIP. Well, just one thing also to note. DRIPA and the UNDRIP, they create a new Indigenous rights regime that works in tandem with the Section 35 Aboriginal rights regime. So remember, we're going to have two regimes dealing with Indigenous rights and Aboriginal rights. The players are the same groups and nations that are involved in the Section 35 Aboriginal rights process are the same ones involved in the Section 30, the UNDRIP process. We're going to look at three categories of UNDRIP rights and powers: land and natural resources, Indigenous government, and Indigenous participation in BC government and the legislative process. Land and natural resources, the next slide, please. Here we have UNDRIP Article 26. Indigenous peoples have the right to the lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used or acquired. This is a very expansive test. The second paragraph, Indigenous peoples have the right to own, use, develop, and control the lands, territories, and resources. So they have the right to those lands, and then they have the right to own, use, develop, and control. The thing to note here, expansive test. Traditionally owned, occupied, not exclusively occupied, just occupied or otherwise used. Because of this, most of BC are probably going to be covered by this test. And the next slide, please. Article 28. Indigenous peoples have the right to redress. Okay, this is remedy by means that can include restitution, which is giving the land back, or if this is not possible, just fair and equitable compensation. And then at the end of that paragraph, which they're talking about properties which have been confiscated, taken, occupied, used, or damaged without their free, prior, and informed consent. This is everything. Okay, this is fee simple, this is leases, everything. So even if the land, for example, is fee simple, they still have a claim to that property. They can, it's going to depend on the implementing legislation, but they can demand that the property be returned, or more likely in most cases, they can demand compensation of some sort. Now look at second paragraph there. Compensation shall take the form of lands, territories, and resources, equal in quality, size, and legal status, or a monetary compensation, or other appropriate redress. Anything, okay? That last item means anything at all. But the key point is they have a claim against everything, all land, every fee simple parcel, all leasehold, everything. By the way, how the claims will be handled will include, it could include compelled restitution. Most cases, it's going to be compensation. And compensation can be very flexible. For example, take a look at Vancouver strategy, UNDRIP strategy in Vancouver, and look at the provisions about shared revenues. The shared revenue idea is related to compensation. So it's flexible, can be almost anything. Okay, for this webinar, I'm going to assume that Indigenous land title is going to cover, about 95% of BC. It could cover 100%. Let's say 95%. Definitely the Crown land. Although Indigenous leaders already claim all of BC, including Vancouver, and Vancouver's UNDRIP strategy concedes that point. Vancouver has already conceded all the main points. They do agree that the land in Vancouver is Indigenous. They have a claim. So there's an Indigenous claim against all land in Vancouver. The next slide, please. We don't know yet what will be the attributes or the elements of Indigenous land title. I've extrapolated this from from UNDRIP and also from jurisprudence regarding Aboriginal title. It's almost certainly going to be exclusive occupation. So 95% at least of BC will be under the exclusive occupation of Indigenous peoples. Now, they're not going to expel everybody. That's not going to happen. But they have the power of exposing over almost the entire province, if not all of it. Now, they're going to have the right to use and exploit and manage the land, and this will be without the constraints relating to Section 35 Aboriginal title. It's going to be more wide open, a wide free use of how to use and exploit and manage the land. They're going to own the natural resources on, under, and under the land. So this is going to be a huge transfer of natural resources from the province to the Indigenous territories that will be formed. It will probably, almost certainly, be a collective ownership, but we don't know all the details of that. Now, this new title, remember we have Aboriginal title under Section 35. I'm calling this Indigenous land title. It's going to be separate title. It's going to overlap and be separate from Section Aboriginal title. Essentially, you have two regimes going on. You've got the Aboriginal rights and Aboriginal title regime, and you've got the UNDRIP Indigenous rights regime. Side by side, parallel, separate, distinct. With one crucial difference also, the UNDRIP regime is statutory. It does not come within Section 35, so it will not have the constitutional protection that Section 35 Aboriginal title has. There's also some, how to describe this? The Citizens Plus concept. This is just routine, but I think people might want to know. Okay, Aboriginal people possess all the rights of any Canadian citizen. They're all the same. It's all the same, equal Canadian rights. And then Aboriginal people have additional rights, the Aboriginal rights, treaty rights, other rights under, for example, the Indian Act. And now plus, they're getting a new set of rights under UNDRIP. So with UNDRIP, there's a concept, I think it's Professor Cairns came up with it, of Citizens Plus. He was talking about they have all the rights of citizens plus other rights coming with Aboriginal rights. And now we're going to have Citizens Plus, because they have the Aboriginal rights in the Indian Act and UNDRIP rights coming in as well, as an addition. Fee simple property. Cities. Okay, will Indigenous governments have claimed urban fee simple property? Yes. See the Vancouver UNDRIP strategy, they've already conceded. Will Indigenous governments share jurisdiction with city government? Yes. See the Vancouver UNDRIP strategy, they've already conceded. Now let's be clear what this means. Almost all of BC's natural resources will be owned by a small minority of BC's population. Almost all of BC territory will be owned by that same minority, and BC will be a patchwork of dozens of Indigenous territories, each with its own Indigenous government, with the right of exclusive occupation. That summarizes where we are so far. That's the UNDRIP vision. This is what they're aiming for. If it's fully implemented, this is what will be. Next, Indigenous governing bodies. Section 1 of DRIPA defines Indigenous governing body as an entity that is authorized to act on behalf of Indigenous peoples that hold rights recognized and affirmed by Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982. I'll refer to this new type of government as is IGB for Indigenous governing body, or simply Indigenous government. UNDRIP Articles 3, 4, and 5 set out the basis for Indigenous government as a right. And under UNDRIP, the Indigenous actors will be the same players as under Section 35. Same. same groups, the Aboriginal groups and nations and so on will be the same ones dealing with the Indigenous rights under UNDRIP. Now, the likely attributes of Indigenous government, again, extrapolating from the UNDRIP document because it doesn't go into detail on this, and also looking at some of the literature. Each Indigenous territory will have its own Indigenous government. Each Indigenous government will be the government of the Indigenous people of that territory, with the obligation to act in the interests of that Indigenous population only. Non-Indigenous or Indigenous belonging to another territory are like foreigners in these territories. They won't have governmental rights, or they won't be part of the citizenry to be taken care of and have their interests protected. Now, the status, the authority, the powers, the capacities, and privileges of Indigenous government, they'll almost certainly be delegated. There's a lot of noise about it being inherent self-government. I'm leaving that aside for now. That's been rejected several times by the Supreme Court of Canada, that idea. And I'm quite confident this time it's going to be delegated powers given out by the BC government. In the event of a conflict of laws between BC law and Indigenous government law, there will be rules determining which law prevails. And since the center of gravity of law in BC will be UNDRIP, because all laws must conform to UNDRIP, expect that in most cases, priority will be given to the Indigenous law of the Indigenous government. It won't be an absolute. BC law can override, but for the most part, priority will go to the Indigenous law. So again, summing up at this point, on each Indigenous territory will be an Indigenous government with a spectrum of authority almost as comprehensive as the provincial government. If you look at UNDRIP and what the Indigenous government is supposed to do, according to UNDRIP, is almost everything. It's just very, very wide, very broad. So essentially expect the powers to be equivalent to the provincial government. And also they're going to be autonomous governments, but with, and we'll get to this later in details, a co-governance relationship with the BC government, which is something very strange, and very important. So at this point, what you have is the mass transfer of power, resources from BC and its residents to the Indigenous minority. You know, this is what UNDRIP envisions. This is the aim of UNDRIP. Oh, there is, by the way, if you're wondering, the non-Indigenous in BC have the obligation to permanently finance Indigenous government operations and economic development and social improvement. That's on the non-Indigenous part of the population. You'll find that in UNDRIP Article 21. Now we come to something very, very peculiar. Indigenous participation in BC provincial governance. We already have the autonomous government. We already have a co-governance relationship where they're working together, and where Indigenous governments will have some veto powers. But they also have this Indigenous participation and a special veto power over administrative measures. Next slide, please. Indigenous peoples have the right to participate in decision-making in matters which would affect their rights. Okay, this is right there. It's just they have a right to participate in some way in the decision-making process. Article 19, the states shall consult, that means BC shall consult with the Indigenous peoples in order to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent before adopting and implementing legislative or administrative measures that may affect them. Free, prior, and informed consent means a veto power. So the Indigenous governments or the Indigenous peoples through their Indigenous governments have a veto power over administrative measures that may affect them and a veto power over legislative measures that may affect them. This is unheard of, by the way. Unheard of. This is so what you have here, adding, remember above we had the regime of co-governance, you have priority of law favoring the Indigenous law. You have an expansive jurisdiction in the autonomous Indigenous governments and a multitude of claims against almost everything and everyone who is non-Indigenous. And now you have Indigenous governments enjoying a special, a most unusual set of rights and powers, giving them participation in BC government operations. Now, what this might be participation in meetings and planning, the usual activities of public administration, including access to internal government information, because they have a right to make informed decisions. This participation might be through a very close liaison process, or it might be actual physical presence of Indigenous personnel in key areas of the BC administration, in the bureaucracy, working with, monitoring, and being part of the meetings and discussions and the planning. In either case, there's going to be a very strange operational integration. BC administration, BC government administration, and Indigenous governments in there with the administration. They're going to be like this, integrating like this very closely. And they will have, remember, the power to veto administrative measures that may affect Indigenous peoples. That is a huge power, huge. Indigenous governments will have the power to also veto legislative measures. Now, this is almost certainly unconstitutional, can't do that, but there are ways around it. The veto could be, the administrative veto could be exercised in the administration where bills are drafted before they get to the legislature. Or if that is not constitutional, they'll simply wait for the law to be enacted. Its implementation will be through the administration, and there they can use their administrative veto to stop it. Okay, this is unheard of. This is extreme, extreme. One result of this, non-Indigenous will be marginalized, transfer of resources and power of the Indigenous territories as a transfer. You're seeing a big transfer of resources and of power to the Indigenous group, to the Indigenous territories. And also it's going to be exercised in this weird new co-government integrated structure, which is completely new, in which structure the Indigenous governments will have these veto powers. I'm going to be a little blunt here and summing up. I'm just going to be blunt. This is what's happening. UNDRIP will create, I will call it a landed aristocracy of Indigenous peoples. You're creating what you want to call it, a caste, an aristocracy, whatever it is. They will own most of BC land and most of its natural resources. They will govern almost all of BC as autonomous governments. Indigenous government will exercise authority and power comparable. Each of the Indigenous governments will have power comparable to that exercised by a province. There will be co-governing agreements. So you're going to have the integrated government of Indigenous and the province working together. Plus, inside that integrated co-governing process, Indigenous governments will have very powerful veto powers. And Indigenous governments will just normally be active somehow within the BC government, whether they're in there physically as like liaisons working inside the administration or simply a close liaison process, whatever that will be. So powerful are the Indigenous governments with their ownership of most of BC and its natural resources and their veto powers, Most decisions will be made in the new integrated governing mechanism of BC government bureaucracy with Indigenous governments. That's where the power is going to center, in that. And within that, you have veto powers being exercised. Government in Victoria that we vote for will usually be unable to act in the interest of the general BC population. It will lack the power to do so. Power has shifted, is moved to this new integrated governing structure, is moved. The Westminster model that was also referenced in that first video is short-circuited by these arrangements. It just doesn't operate anymore. And I think that's the last of my comments. It is, in other words, a Frankenstein situation. I don't know how much BC government intends to implement it. I don't know if they understand the implications. What I have described is full implementation of UNDRIP. And the BC government has promised they're going to implement UNDRIP fully. And that's what I've described. And that's all, Lisa, Lorraine.
Thanks very much, Jeffrey. Lots of questions and comments coming from that, so we'll get to those later. Joshua, do you want to unmute and take the floor?
Hello, everybody. I know a lot of my brothers and sisters are out there squeezing out comments concerning, that we are on unceded territory, that this whole UN debacle is all that it is. I just want to make a comment that what I'm going to read has to do with the control measures that the UN is going to implement in my thinking. Jeffrey, I don't know if there's going to be a cooperation between the First Nations groups and the government. I think that the government's first agreement would that they still pay taxes, which is, I'm commenting here, they want to get their chunk, as well as, let's say, if the Haida group gets their chunk as well, so more taxes will be taken out. The biggest question I've been asked since our last gathering was, Joshua, can they take my property and give it to the First Nations? I've been talking about UNDRIP for over 3 years, and I've mentioned time and time again that they can take the certificate of registration and transfer it to the Indigenous territory. Now, when I talk about the Indigenous territory or the First Nations people, they are federally owned, funded, and operated groups. These, I would not call them traditional or hereditary people. I know there's very good people within many of the First Nations communities that I'm connected with and speak to. They really don't know what's going on half the time, and my little talk here is to share the full UN narrative of what they want to do. The territory that has been claimed through DRIPA, which ascended November 28th, 2019, they have claimed the rights, and as we have seen recently, and what Jeffrey mentioned, that it is a legally non-binding resolution, which is what he mentions is quite true. It's an aspiration. The UN to me is like a really big club with a lot of power, and they want to assert their power to create what they're doing here in Canada and especially right now in British Columbia. Most lands, properties are fee simple title, which means that you have to pay your taxes on your land yearly and also pay an added costs for infractions that may be levied against you, even by third-party groups such as the Water Sustainability Act, which is also a UN-sponsored initiative. There are many sustainable initiatives and groups like this waiting for a piece of your income and to cripple you financially. I am sure you've heard of the carbon credits that you and everyone has to pay into, which is also now publicly traded companies to take what you are forced to pay to make money with it. How many millions in backroom deals have been set up to backpocket your money? Many, and it is an illegal and criminal activity. Have you ever asked who your certificate of registration is registered to? This is about your homes. My brothers and sisters will contend otherwise, but I'm speaking to you specifically on the agenda that the UN is bringing forward. It is supposed to be your home or property ownership papers. I bet you left it to your real estate agent or your lawyer and never looked at it. The BC Land Title and Survey, or LTSA, can help you there. But can you registration or your certificate of registration be transferred? I believe it can. As when the land was given back, as in the Haida Title Lands Agreement, your land or business or your fishing or tourism business can most definitely be transferred to the Haida people. You will still have to pay, and that's where this cooperative agreement comes in, because the province doesn't want to lose its taxes, but there will be an add-on tax to the Haida Nation. Remember, this will be administrated through UN initiatives who will find ways to make it impossible to keep what you think you own. The infrastructure of the Indigenous communities do not have the strength to be able to take over cities and larger groups. They need help. And what's happening, and I've sat across the table from these people who are trained and hired by the UN. They are with their initiatives and with their administration will take over much of the administration that are dealing with the First Nations communities that are claiming UNDRIP and the lands being given back. In 2008, you may remember the US real estate market crashed, as it did in many other countries, like even in Canada. Recently, the Bank of Canada is alerting that the sharp correction in the markets could lead to a system-wide stress. The stress is part of the doing of the CDS, or the credit default swaps. In 2008, it was approximately $26 trillion. Today, it has grown to past $6.5 quadrillion. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is because I'm looking at the future of what I think that the UN is planning to do. Mostly, who holds the insurance on the most of the homes in BC in case they go into default? And if you don't understand credit default swaps, please look at the movie, what's it called? There's something short. But most of the default swaps for your homes going into default are bought up by Chinese subsidiaries or the CCP. Some other countries are buying for your mortgage failures. One of them is Saudi Arabia. If you don't know what default swaps are, watch the movie The Big Short, or watch some tutorials. It's very important to understand where this is going to be going in the future. If, for instance, this Haida UN initiative of UNDRIP, if they go into default, if things happen where they cannot keep it going, the bank holder is the UN, because it is their agreement. If they go into default, the creditors are the CCP, groups like BlackRock and others waiting to collect. And I truly believe that this is their plan. I'm really grateful that people like Tim Hillman and Brian Isaac, not that they may have the full picture, but Tim is finally seeing that the issue of the coexistence of Indigenous and non-Indigenous would be very difficult if the UN is running the show. We have people, we need to come together, both Indigenous, we all need to be Indigenous and work together in a loving and harmonious way to tend our lands. The Indigenous, and I have spoken to some leaders, and they say we cannot be a colonizer if all the territories are taken over. They don't have it in them. That comes in direct words from a leader. This is why the United Nations initiatives are preparing to define and regulate what Indigenous laws are, rights and freedoms. I called one of the nations connected to the Vancouver strategy, and I asked for a copy of their Indigenous law. And I was told that they don't have one. So somebody is formulating, and it's not them. Soon, everyone will begin to understand what is really going on with UNDRIP. I really believe they will. And I truly believe we will be able to stop it in its tracks. What it's doing is it will be giving land to a group called the UN that will be empowered to take land. I would ask, I know there's racism starting because of UNDRIP. Don't be violent towards the First Nations people, as I've been personally verbally attacked, spit on by people who live in great fear. Many Indigenous peoples are absolutely lovely and have no idea what strings of power, what they're doing to their people. They don't know what's happening. They're just so glad to have their lands back. The expression of anti-Indigenous has already begun with false and misleading narratives. A friend of mine, Rima, is right on the money, and she's been making statements on here, is that we need to get out of the UN completely. This is when the WHO and the WEF will be a thing of the past. And all the UN initiatives that are here to undermine our economy and to create a slave society of all our people will be sent packing. That's there's so many initiatives. There's an agricultural sustainability plan. It's like we cannot move in any way possible if we allow the UN in all their little cracks and crevices to continue. She has a site called preventgenocide2030.org, and you should really visit it. So what is my solution for all this from an Indigenous point of view, my point of view? Another friend, Dolores, is teaching about real law versus legal fiction, which is linked to a moral contingency, the law of an abiding morality that brings us together by being each other's neighbor. We're so, the laws and the practices are getting so convoluted, are getting so difficult to follow. And I also think that is part of their plan. It's a law of compensation that goes back thousands of years and is still valid today. Government workers, politicians, and representatives of sustainability funded groups are fiduciary agents and have duties and responsibilities such as holding a legal or ethical relationship of trust, like our politicians. They have a responsibility to work with you and to do no harm. When that trust is broken, we have to act accordingly. When actions are taken in a form of unreasonable taxes or tickets against the public, such as raising the property tax. I have a friend, he used to pay $1,200 per year, and it just went up to $30,000, which I have, which shocked me because the local government wants his land for something else, so they raised it to $30,000. This is criminal malfeasance. Criminal malfeasance, which is a high crime in the Canadian system and is punishable with 14 years in prison. When a representative shuts off your well that feeds your animals or crops, this is criminal malfeasance, and we have actionable solutions for these activities that will be coming in the months to come. What do I hold in my spirit, in my prayers, and in my heart? I hold a space. I hold a space without fear, and I see the dissolution of the wicked. I spend my time seeing men and women and children living and thriving together without oppression and living in tyranny. And that's what's happening. That's what's coming. What I see is more real than where we are right now. It's not fake or fantasy, but real, and as real as I live. There's a story of Cecil Paul, and I hope everybody looks him up. He's an Indigenous man who made decisions across the world. And he had a saying, which was, there is room enough in my canoe for you. I know the trees breathe and greet me every day. The mountains and the rivers and stream long to unite with the Indigenous. And that's you and me. The new Indigenous are coming, and I know it with every fiber of my being. I don't know all the aspects of where this is all going. I just know something new is coming, and it is important for us to extricate ourselves from what is happening. I don't know how we're going to do it, but I know it's going to happen. I don't judge those that come against me or us, but I beckon them, and I've spoken to some people who are definitely on the other side. I beckon them to come and share that little spark that they knew when they were young. It is love versus fear. And right now, I know a lot of people, a lot of my brothers and sisters here, understand what's really going on. They have their own de jure governance. They understand unceded territory. They understand what's really going on. But love and fear cannot exist in the same space. I know I have shared some daunting information, talking about what's happening with the UN and what's really going on in my perspective. That is what I'm looking for. I can see it. But everything can be overturned in a moment. And that's what I manifest every day. It may sound ridiculous to some, but that's all I do. With knowledge comes wisdom to act and create solutions. My solution is in the power of the fruits of life, of love, and the spirit. I move forward in all humanity, in seeing the end result, in grace, in hope, in kindness, in goodness, in caring for others, in being sharp and resolute in my being, in meekness and in joy and happiness, and knowing that I've already won. There's enough room in my canoe for you. We're one. Thank you, Errol. Sorry.
Thank you, Joshua. That was very moving. Bruce, I'll let you finish it up.
Thank you. You know what? I'm going to try to be fairly quick because I want to leave people time to ask questions and for us to discuss things. And it's going to be a difficult a thing to follow on from what Joshua said. So I want to change tracks. I've read the questions that came from the last session we had, the first one, and I've been reading the chat. And there's a lot of confusion about what the law is, how it works, how this relates to that, what's going on. And so I just want to take just a couple of minutes to clarify some things, perhaps to debunk some things. And the first thing is this, is the use of this word law, because it can mean several different things. And sometimes it's not clear which one of those meanings people mean. There is God's law. There is natural law. There is moral law and more. This word law can be used in all these various ways. And I want to talk to you just briefly about the law as it is applied in courts. I'm not talking about God's law. I'm not talking about natural law. I'm not talking about moral law. I'm talking about the law that we mean when we talk about the legal system in this country. And what is that law? Put simply, the law is what courts do, and sometimes how they explain it. That is all. So if you come into a court and you want to win, then you need to tell that court something they like so that they will do what you ask them to do. And we have lots and lots of material, cases and statutes and so on that give hints about what courts do. And we know an awful lot about what courts will not do. But if you keep the idea narrow like that, you will not be led off into left field. There are a lot of theories floating around about all kinds of things. And maybe some of those theories bleed into the other kinds of meanings of the law, God's law, natural law, and so on. I got no problem with those at all. If you're expressing an opinion, for example, about how things ought to be, or what the history was, or what the facts are, okay, maybe you're right. I'm talking about what the courts do. And there are theories out there that are in conflict, inconsistent with what the courts do. Let me just give you a couple of examples. There are people who insist that the guiding document in these times of trouble is the Canadian Bill of Rights. That is not so. The Canadian Bill of Rights is a federal statute. It is not part of the Constitution. It applies only to matters of federal jurisdiction. It does not apply to provinces. That is, does not apply to provincial law. When provinces legislate within their constitutional jurisdiction, the Bill of Rights does not apply. If you want to know that that is so, go and read the cases. And you can go and read the Bill of Rights itself. In fact, let me just, it'll take too long. I won't bother. But if you want to understand the application of the Bill of Rights, you can go and read the cases and see what the pattern is. Yeah, we have a charter. And yeah, the charter has been warped. But it is part of the Constitution, and the courts are using it the way they use it. And I'm not saying that the Bill of Rights doesn't still exist. It does. It's still a valid statute. But its application and its usefulness is extremely limited. Don't put your eggs in that basket. Other examples. You know, we have lots of theories about natural law and sovereign people and freemen on the land and the idea that Canada doesn't exist because it's a corporation, that we don't have a constitution because the Queen, when she was coronated, didn't put her hand on the right stone. Okay? These are not theories that will let you win in a courtroom. If you argue these things, you'll be thrown out on your butt. Whether they have some validity out there elsewhere in the real world, I have no idea. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about what will happen when you go before a judge and say, Your Honor, here's what I want you to do, and here's why. If you give them these theories, you will lose. Now, how do we know that the courts have give valid judgments? Well, because the proof of the pudding is in the eating. They give judgments, and the muscle of the state does what the courts say. And that is all. You can look into the history or not as you wish. That's the proof of the pudding. This is the way it works. The law is based upon authority and the monopolistic violence of the state. It's not based upon the truth. It's not based upon the facts. It's not based upon the science. It's not based upon morality. It's a very narrow thing. So when you make legal decisions and decide how to approach cases that you're trying to win, think strategically, not morally. There's an old saying that goes, there's 4 versions of the truth. What the plaintiff said, what the defendant said, what the court finds, and what actually happened. So don't put all your eggs on the idea that what actually happened is going to prevail, because the court enters into a very difficult kind of fact-finding process, and there's no guarantee that they'll actually find the facts that actually happened. All right, more basics. I'm almost done, and we can turn to questions. As you probably know, Canada is a federation. It has provinces and federal government. One question that's come up several times is, well, there's DRIPA in BC. There's a statute in the federal government. Now, since we have a federal statute that does basically the same thing as the BC statute, as DRIPA, doesn't that mean now that all laws in Canada, in all the provinces, have to now comply with the federal statute? And the answer is no, because we have this federal structure. And what that federal structure means is that you have 2 levels of government, and levels is the wrong word because they're not levels. They are parallel. They are side by side. The federal government is not above the provincial government. They have 2 different sets of jurisdictions. And the BC Act applies to matters within BC jurisdiction. And the federal act applies within areas of federal jurisdiction. And if there's no Ontario Act that is the equivalent of DRIPA, then there is no such act that deals with those matters within Ontario's jurisdiction. Okay. There is this thing called paramountcy, where there's a conflict between the federal and the provincial, in which case the federal may prevail, but that's not this kind of situation. On international law, there's lots of questions about international law and the status. And what Jeffrey said, I think, is exactly right, but it's being confused. So what Jeffrey said was that UNDRIP is a General Assembly Declaration, United Nations General Assembly Declaration. It has no force of law in Canada on its own. You cannot go into a court in Manitoba with UNDRIP in your hand and say, apply this. They won't do it. The general rule for international law is that it must be incorporated into domestic law in order to be enforceable in Canadian courts. Now, the Supreme Court of Canada has extended the net, if you like, in recent years. And there are more ways to incorporate international law, but again, not directly. So here's the favorite one: when those international documents have not been incorporated, the courts will say, well, we have an international treaty, say, and Canada has agreed to the treaty. And so we don't have a statute that incorporates the treaty into Canadian law, but we have another statute. And we are going to interpret that statute with the assumption that that statute is consistent with the international obligations that Canada has accepted. Now, that is possible when the statute is ambiguous, as in we don't really know what this means. It could mean X, it could be Y. Which of one of those two things is consistent with the international document? We'll choose that one. Okay, fine. But here's what does not happen. If Canada signs on to a treaty and that a statute is passed that directly conflicts with the treaty, the statute prevails, the treaty does not. In that sense, the treaty is subordinate to domestic law. And all of this is about actual treaties, which the UN Declaration is not. It is a mere declaration of the General Assembly. It really has no status whatsoever, except for the fact that it has been incorporated in DRIPA and in the federal statute. Okay, so in those places, in those provinces where there is no such statute, UNDRIP has no status whatsoever. And Lorraine, maybe I'll just stop there. There are lots of other questions that I might cover, but in the interest of time and the interest of letting people have their questions, why don't I just pause there and we'll go down that road.
Sure, that sounds great. Thanks, Bruce. Yeah, so I'm just gonna kind of start at the top, I think. And
actually, before you do that, so seeing as I was on this topic, let me just finish off the question. So we have somebody in the chat who is talking about a 2007 decision of the Supreme Court of Canada called HAPE, and suggesting that in paragraphs 39 and 43, there is an explicit decision by the Supreme Court of Canada that incorporates UNDRIP into Canadian law. Not true. If you read that case and those paragraphs, that is not what it says. What it says is pretty much what I just described.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, because that is one of the questions. Okay, let me just get going. Who has the authority to speak for and sign agreements for the Aboriginal peoples? First Nations elected, I don't know what CNC means, or it's probably the council in chief, or hereditary chiefs and councils. First Nations is an Indian Act policy. Non-status Indigenous, the vast majority of Indigenous, are not represented by First Nations chief and council.
Yeah, well, this is the thing about, so let's just take a step back. Let's acknowledge something. So what we're talking about here is, when we talk about a thing called Aboriginal law, here's two different concepts, and I'm going to use two different labels. And the label, there's nothing magic about the labels. I'm just using two different ones to distinguish between them. Two ideas. I'm going to use the label Aboriginal law and Indigenous law. Okay, Aboriginal law, by that I mean the law with the Canadian law of Aboriginal law. That is the law applied by Canadian courts to the question of the status of Aboriginals, Aboriginal title, and so on and so forth. It is a part of Canadian law applied by Canadian courts. Indigenous law, not a label, to use for the idea of the laws that the various Indigenous groups themselves may apply within their own communities. And of course, because the communities are different, Indigenous law will be different from place to place. Okay? In Aboriginal law, that is the law, the Canadian law, Canadian Aboriginal law, is a hopeless mess. It has constitutional aspects to it. It has all kinds of decisions made by all kinds of courts that don't help and create all kinds of expectations and rights and obligations that don't make any sense. And the question that you just asked about who represents who is part of the mess or Aboriginal law. Like how do you know who it is that speaks for who? And part of this trouble comes from the fact that we are talking about a false thing. And by a false thing, I mean the idea that there are distinct groups of people with distinct genetic lines who deserve to be treated differently in the law. I mean, that to me is the core problem. It starts from a bad premise. And if you tried to do that across the board in a country like Canada, you'd bring the walls down. It wouldn't work. But because we've been trying for so long, it's difficult to turn this around now. It's in the Constitution. And so the non-Aboriginal authorities have this problem of, well, who do we talk to? And I have no idea the proper way to answer that question. And I'm sure they don't either.
Okay. Someone says, I've heard some BC farmers are giving their land to the First Nations. Is that true? If so, why are they doing it? And is it a good idea?
Well, so let's talk about the Hyde Agreement for a minute, because I think that will help to answer the question you just asked. So, and Jeffrey referred to this, I think, quite correctly. The concept of Aboriginal title is important to understand because it's not the same thing as the title that is not Aboriginal title. Mm-hmm. So if you give Aboriginal title to a group, that's a particular kind of thing. It is what the courts call sui generis, which only means it's its own thing. It doesn't look like anything else. But it has several characteristics, and here are two of the important ones. Number one, that title cannot be alienated to anyone but the Crown. So if you go to an Aboriginal group that has title to an area of land like Haida Gwaii, and you say, look, how about I buy a fee simple from you over this plot of land? And they say, fine. That fee simple that you buy from them is not like a fee simple that you had, in Vancouver. Because that fee simple can only be given back to the Aboriginal group or with their agreement transferred to somebody else. It is not something that you hold free and clear because it is within the package called Aboriginal title. So you are transacting for something entirely different and you don't really know what it is. And so if you find yourself in one of these areas and you're considering giving your land to the group that's getting title, or you think is getting some kind of say in the way things are going, okay, maybe that's a strategic move that you think is viable. I can't say yay or nay to that, but understand what you're doing. You are surrendering your property rights, the ones that you know, in favor of something you don't know. You don't know how that's going to be governed. You don't know what the nature of the interest is you're going to get back. You don't know to whom you're going to alienate it. It is a big black box. And as Jeffrey mentioned, the terms that comprise the Haida Gwaii Agreement are internally inconsistent. They do not make sense. And so if you're willing to go along with that and trust that, then good luck to you.
Okay. What if there was, I'm just going to follow on to that, because what if there was a specific First Nation that you, and I'm going to invite Jeffrey and Joshua to unmute and take part of the discussion, jump in wherever you want to. So what if there was a specific First Nation that you felt your land might as well be with them, and then it has the protections of whatever the Aboriginal rights and title would be?
Well, I mean, that's a judgment for you to make, but remember that you don't know, well, maybe you do, but you might not know how the place is going to be run. And you don't know to what extent how it's run is answerable to the courts. I mean, to what extent is this independent? To what extent is it democratic? To what extent is it corrupt? I mean, I'm not saying that they're all corrupt. I'm not saying that at all, but it's possible. If you don't know the inside, you don't know, what the power struggles are inside. You don't know who's going to run it this year and next year. I mean, maybe if you know enough, you think you know enough to trust all of that human dynamic, great. Would make me very nervous.
It's very dependent on who, for instance, agrees within the First Nation. I had a situation where a husband died. He was Indigenous. The wife was white. And the chief said, you can stay here as long as you like. So she stayed in the home. The next chief was voted in and she was kicked out immediately.
Right.
So it depends on who's running the show.
Exactly.
Okay. What is the consequence of UNDRIP's ratification and consensual entrenching into Section 35 of the Constitution?
Yeah, right.
I'll
Keep
just
going.
finish. Yeah. Federal Bill C-15 ratified UNDRIP. Bill C-15 expressly states that nothing delays UNDRIP. The UNDRIP was recently endorsed by the unanimous decision of the SCC, Supreme Court of Canada, in an act respecting Métis children on February 9th, 2024. Isn't this binding on BCSC?
Well, the Supreme Court of Canada decision will be binding as far as it goes, but it's a federal statute, right? So it applies to a matter of federal jurisdiction. I thought the question was going somewhere else, but so let me just fill in where I thought it was going. I think a very good point. So we, as people probably know, we have Section 35 in the Constitution, and we also have Section 25 in the Charter, which is also part of the Constitution. Here's the problem. Legislatures, both the BC legislature and Parliament, can pass statutes within their jurisdiction saying anything they want as long as it's not contrary to the Constitution. So at the moment, if a new government comes into power in BC, they can repeal DRIPA. Okay. However, if the BC government right now makes title agreements with certain groups, the status of those agreements, the status of Aboriginal title that it creates might very well become part of the Constitution. In other words, you can go one direction, but you might not be able to back up. So the further this lasts and the more of these Haida-Gwaii agreements are passed, the more you're going to be stuck, because the courts are going to say, well, Section 35 and we have Aboriginal title, it's an agreement, we can't go back on that now, it's entrenched. So that is one of the problems that you're facing right now.
If I could just add to that, there are a couple of theories on how they can move UNDRIP rights into Section 35. That's one, what Bruce just mentioned is one. Another one is, it was that reference case on the Métis. And it doesn't make any sense when you first look at it, but they're trying to say that UNDRIP was incorporated not into the statute, but into kind of like a general existence in the federal law, which makes no sense to me. But if it's sitting there, something like a common law system of rights, just sitting there, not in the statute, it is open for a court to say, well, this looks like a right that belongs in Section 35. And they can just declare it's protected by Section 35. So there are ways that the UNDRIP rights could end up in Section 35. It would be a disaster, but it is possible. And in fact, there is a federal legal strategy to do just this. They are going after judicial declaration. Eventually, it's going to take years from the SEC that UNDRIP is part of Section 35. It would be a disaster.
In a culture that has no concept of land ownership, how can land ownership be claimed or returned or confirmed or similar?
Well, I accept the premise of the question, but the courts are doing it, so it can be done. I mean, that's the crude answer to the question. And this kind of objection comes up a lot, not that specific one, but in general, they, you know, the kind of objection that comes at, well, this doesn't make any sense. You know, how can it be this and not that? And I agree a lot of times with these kinds of objections. Very fair, but it doesn't matter because the courts are doing it anyway.
Agreed. I know that through discussions of natural law, the regular community has always believed in the right to private ownership of private property. In the Indigenous way, it's always been that it was the creator's land and we needed it tended like a garden. So there's opposing views in natural law, and creates a big problem as to, well, where does it fit?
Right. And that and Josh was also alluding to I meant to mention two features of Aboriginal title. One that I mentioned was being able to be alienated only to the Crown. The other one I meant to mention was that it's communal, right? It belongs to the group. And therefore, if you hold Aboriginal title, you cannot do the same kinds of things with it to the benefit of all the individual people of the group as if you were dealing with other kinds of property interests that we're familiar with, right? This acts to the detriment of the individual rank and file Aboriginal person. It leaves all the power in the Aboriginal elite. Yeah. And this is not a system that you would want if you were not one of those elites.
Thanks. Provincial statutes can't overrule the federal constitution or Supreme Court of Canada ruling, can they? And I think this relates to the comment about if a government in BC decided to repeal DRIPA, things would be better. But I think this person is implying maybe not.
No, by statute, you cannot repeal the Constitution, and you cannot alter the Supreme Court's interpretation of what the Constitution means by statute. You can change the results in any case. Like if Supreme Court says, all right, here's the law as of now. If that is not a constitutional judgment, then you can pass a statute saying, well, we don't want the law that way. We want it this way. If it's a constitutional judgment, though, Supreme Court has the last word.
Well, what about Bill C-15?
Oh, Bill C-15, the federal one? As of right now, if a new government could come in and repeal that bill, repeal that statute. Now, that is assuming that Jeffrey's point, that the courts would not be inclined to say, well, you know, we've crossed a line here, and now we think that the substance of UNDRIP is now properly thought to be contained within Section 35 of the Constitution. If that happens, you're toast.
Okay. I'm not quite sure I understand this question, but I'm going to throw it out there. There needs to be a voice from the hereditary original peoples who occupied this land, referred to as Canada, prior and was unceded. There is no claim by the Crown, monarch, or British, nor French, nor Spanish.
I don't understand the question.
Maybe I will, and I'm riffing here, but is there any validity to the statement that there's no claim by the Crown, the monarch, British, French, or Spanish?
No.
Okay.
No. So let me go back to Aboriginal title for a minute. The concept of Aboriginal title, as it presently exists in the territory we call Canada, is title that is within the rule of the Crown, of the Canadian Crown. That's what defines what it means. That's why the courts have the role of defining what it means. That's why we're referring to the courts to describe what it means. You know, a First Nation with Aboriginal title is still not a nation in the international sense. It's not a country like Canada is a country. It's its own sui generis thing. That is, it's its own thing that exists within the contours of Canadian law.
Okay. Okay. This one's come up before. So is anyone born in BC considered Indigenous? And anyone born in BC who states that they are unconquered is Indigenous?
Neither. I mean,
okay.
Yeah, no, okay. Let's distinguish between what we would like to be the case and what makes logical sense. I agree that somebody born in a place is native to the place. I mean, this makes sense. But in terms of the legal category that the courts are dealing with and the legislation is dealing with and the UNDRIP is dealing with, no, that's not what Indigenous means. It's a particular category of person. Now, they might not have defined the category very well, but there's still a category.
Gotcha. If Canadian governments have incorporated UNDRIP into Canadian law, then what effect will exiting the UN have?
Well, listen, our government, a new government tomorrow could reverse Canadian acceptance of UNDRIP. You say, we don't want to be part of that anymore. We don't agree. And then you could repeal the federal statute and DRIPA. And hopefully that's done in time before too much damage is done.
Yeah, no, it's very, very easy at this point to get rid of it. Just have to repeal the statute. It's very easy.
That's right.
Okay.
Now, is there a difference between the provincial agreement as opposed to the federal agreements that were signed? Can the federal government just get rid of it all across the board, or okay.
Yeah, no, when the province is dealing with provincial lands, they have the jurisdiction to do that.
A follow-up to that is, once you get out of the UN, are you out of all of its pieces, including WHO, et cetera?
Sure. So in spite of everything, we still have the concept of sovereignty. Now, yeah, it's starting to get a little weak. The courts are starting to be, sympathetic to the idea that customary international law ought to, have some role, but we still have sovereignty. So when the UK joined the EU, it agreed to follow the EU rules about all kinds of stuff. And then it got fed up with it. And it was very politically difficult to resolve to get out, but they did. And they could do so because they're sovereign. So if a sovereign country comes along and says, you know what, we're out. We don't want to do this anymore. That is their right. That doesn't mean the other sovereign countries can't say, fine, then we're not playing with you anymore. You can't be part of this, you can't be part of that. We don't want to trade with you, yada, yada, yada. So it wouldn't be easy, but it can be done.
Okay. Someone's asking for you to please address, and I don't know how to say this, I'm sorry, DeSautel, paragraph 68, Supreme Court of Canada.
I have to look it up. I don't have the paragraphs in my head. What's the nature of the question?
That's all that's there. I'll see later if it comes up again.
Okay.
With more context. Okay, here we go. What about adverse possession, which is recognized in provincial law? If these lands have been possessed for the past 100 years, the lands cannot be given to someone else.
No, adverse possession is not going to work. Adverse possession is a theory, basically, that when you are trespassing on someone's fee simple, that person cannot thereafter sue you for trespass because they've waited too long. Okay. Now, I can see the analogy, like, sure, in the broad sense, I can see what they're talking about, but I'd be very surprised that kind of approach would work.
Okay. Why is Ontario registered in Washington, D.C.?
Oh, lots of countries. Listen, countries operate in corporate form in all kinds of places. Canada is registered as a corporation as well, I think, in the SEC in New York. That doesn't mean it's not a country. It just means that in order to do business, it needs corporate form.
Okay. How about we get juries of the people back into the courtroom rather than be subject to the biased judgment of a government-appointed judge?
For what cases? We already have juries, many criminal trials, even civil trials. It's already there. Maybe they're asking, why can't we have juries in other cases? An expanded use of the jury, maybe they're getting at. Well, we could. That's just easy to change the law. You can expand use of the jury.
Or maybe they mean more referenda to vote on bills and such. But that's a reflection of how badly our democracy now works. Because it was supposed to be that way now. It was supposed to be that the people who we elect would kind of do what we want them to do, but that's not working very well.
Yeah, good point. I'm more confused with what the speakers are saying, and then people in the chat saying the speaker is wrong. I don't know what is true and what we can do to protect the land that we bought.
Right. Well, so ask that person to give us a few more specifics so we can drill down, if possible, on the matter on which she is confused about.
Okay, so if you're still on this call, if you want to type in a little bit more context on that in the chat, that would be great. Well, a similar one here. What can I do to ensure the land and home I purchased will remain mine until I choose to sell it?
Well, see, but you see, that question is getting to the heart of the problem we're talking about, because your government. So the heart of this problem is our own government. Our own government is causing this problem. This is not the UN. This is not the WEF. I mean, the WEF may have a hand in it, and the WHO might is a bad outfit, and the UN is terrible. I'm not suggesting anything else, but the people who are acting badly right now are our own government, passing statutes that are bad, making plans that are bad, making agreements that are bad. These people are doing it on their own and putting us in this terrible situation. Don't need to look overseas. The bad actors are right here in front of us.
Right. Please explain how peoples who eschewed any claim to ownership of the land now suddenly get to own the land based on their hereditary ownership of the land, which their leaders repudiated over and over again.
I don't know about the repudiation part, but UNDRIP has a very expansive test. Did you mere occupation, not exclusive occupation? Did you use the land? Did you otherwise own it in some way under Indigenous law, or did you acquire it in some other way? It's a very, very expansive test. It goes beyond the Section 35 Aboriginal title test. It's much, much broader. So that's why. So if you're going to have land now that's going to be included as Indigenous title, that would not be included in Aboriginal title. But it's just because of the wording of UNDRIP. That's all it is. Okay.
This question, I think, is probably worthy of a webinar in itself. But I think what they're asking is for a bit of a definition for those of us who aren't very knowledgeable. What does unceded actually mean when the tradition does not include ownership of the land? And we referred to this a little bit above, but I think, again, it goes to what would have that Indigenous traditional ownership look like, and what would a ceding look like?
Yeah, no, this is part of the challenge that the courts have always struggled with in terms of looking into land claims, right? The nature of the occupation and the use that would be necessary in order to maintain a claim. And then once the title is obtained, then to define the kinds of uses it can be put to, which is not across the board. I mean, so the Supreme Court of Canada on occasion has said that in those situations where Aboriginal title exists, the group in question can only use the land in ways that are consistent with the way it was used before. right? And that's going to change over time too. What characterizes this area of the law in this country is the fact that you can't nail anything down. Same thing goes for this duty to consult. Nobody knows what it means. And so there are restrictions. Yes, it's not open season if you have Aboriginal title based upon a certain kind of occupation and use, then your use of that land under the title is restricted to some extent by the nature of the claim that you made. But where the limits are, who knows?
As for the unceded part, unceded just means that they haven't surrendered it in a treaty. They haven't otherwise disposed of it. It doesn't mean it's their land. For it to be their land, they have to meet the Aboriginal title test, or under UNDRIP, the new Indigenous land test. Unceded just means it hasn't been surrendered through a treaty.
So if there is a treaty,
it doesn't mean it's Aboriginal title land or anything. It might be, but it might not be.
so if there is a treaty in place,
if there's a treaty, it'll be considered ceded. They've ceded the land.
Somebody in the chat just asked whether or why the questions in the chat were getting all the attention. Is there another source of questions that we should be aware of?
Not that I'm aware of. I think it's because some people have their hands up and want to chat, but I think we stated.
I see. Okay.
I mean, the intention at the beginning was to make sure that we'd get to the answers in the chat,
Right.
as well as cover all of the presentations.
Gotcha. Okay.
I think what we can do is, we've just got a couple more small ones here, and if there's a few minutes left and you want to take questions from the audience, we can do that, but we're limited on time left. So
Sure. Okay.
okay.
Yeah.
What about the sale of land in simple words, the land title that we own for our property in fee simple can be transferred to the group of First Nations. Do we need to pay more taxes for the First Nations government on the land?
If you transfer your fee simple to a First Nation, I mean, you do
Well,
it
I
you sell it to them?
think the question is if your land is given to the First Nation without your consent,
Oh, I see. So
you might still be on it, but then are you paying double taxes?
Oh, possibly. Sure. Absolutely. I mean, they have control of the land. They can decide whether or not you're allowed to stay and what the conditions are if you are.
What about the sale of land by natives back in the past? How can that land be taken back when it was legitimately sold?
Probably not.
I think the point of contention as well is, was it legitimate? And that's where problems come in, concerning what they might call, legitimate. And that's where the problem comes in when they go to the courts.
Right. So in those, let's make it concrete. Those lands that are subject to treaties in Ontario, for example, are not going to be reversed. I mean, those treaties are not going to be reversed. So that's a transaction I think that the courts will conclude was completed. Now, there may be other situations in which it's not quite so clear.
Right. Okay, I think if you want, we can go to questions from the audience. I think we've got I'm sorry, I'm not sure how to say your name. Papua Jeffries, I think had his hand up for a while. I probably need Erica or Lisa to unmute you. I need a host.
Yeah, his name's Papoise.
Okay, thank you. And when you do get unmuted, if you could state your question as succinctly as possible so that we can hopefully get to the couple of other hands up, that would be great.
Thank you for holding these people accountable. And first of all, I have to say that the courts are a remnant of the Hudson's Bay Company. It is not a what do you call it, a common right of the people. It's there for the Corporation of Canada that was installed in 1860. So if there is a question of a corporation and that it follows the rule of law, of international law, and I know both the two or three of you spoke on the rights of Indigenous people. A UN statute doesn't apply here because we've and Joshua was with me when we wrote a grand jury document stopping the UN from coming to this land without a first written consent by our people. Is that if Canada as a corporation is to follow the rule of law, international law, then the Kamloops Treaty of 408 AD exists today. And the international lawyer, Meredith Quinn, has stated this several times. Lester House has stated it, and now I state it, is that the laws on this land are corpus juris secundum, a second body of law. And when you're talking about Indigenous, you're talking about the first law of the land. And the question is, do you understand that all the proclamations and this phony Constitution UK is only English statute on this land? And that how can, a good question for you, how can Canada, as an Admiralty corporation, make rules on the land when it's a ship at sea? Canada is considered a ship signed in a box at sea. So both of you, how do you determine if Canada, as in an Admiralty law, has jurisdiction over the hereditary here? Thank you.
Yep. That's sort of what I was talking about at the beginning. That you go into a courtroom and talk about that, they'll throw you out on your behind. That doesn't make any sense. It might make some sense to you based upon historical facts that you maybe managed to uncover or heard spoken by somebody. That's totally fine. It has nothing to do with the law in the courts as it presently exists.
Can we unmute Slavica? And again, I'll just remind questions to go quickly because I'd like to get to
my question is, if the people wanted to abolish the government, what would be necessary to do that?
Abolish the government?
Yes.
I think it's
Abolish
a revolution.
them. Get rid of them. You're telling us that they're the problem. It's time to get rid of them. Abolish them. How many people would it take and how many provinces?
Well, okay, so amending the Constitution is very difficult.
Not
but
amending,
it's possible.
abolishing the government.
All right, but you have to describe what you're talking about. Are you talking about revolution?
No, I'm talking about doing it in a peaceful, legal way when people have had more than enough of a government.
Okay. Yeah, but okay, let's just be real here for a minute. There is our Constitution contains amending formulas, and that is, if you want to change the foundation of the country, they've established a formula that you have to meet. And if you don't like those formulas and you don't go along with that idea, then you are talking about revolution. Those are the only two choices. You have to comply or not. If you're not complying, you're talking about getting enough people to roll over the existing powers and establish a new country.
Okay, so let's say that tomorrow, 80% of Canada, 80% of Canada decided that they no longer wanted this government in power or any other government, that we wanted to do things on our own and direct our own steps and make our own decisions. What would be necessary to do that?
Okay, so to be clear, I totally agree with you about the desirability of that destination. I would like that too. I think when I'm here trying to explain our Constitution, I'm not doing that because I approve of it. I don't think that the existing system works very well. I would like to change it too.
I believe you. And I noticed that.
But the path from here to there is very difficult to see. And if we could figure out a way to do this in a way that was peaceful and populist in the best sense of that word, as in democratic, if 80% of the population agreed with what you just said, then there surely would be a way. But we have existing systems that are not working very well. But if you had 80% of the people with you, then it would be at least possible to try and use the existing systems, as bad as they are, to transition from what we have to what you're describing. I would like to think that would be possible.
I would offer that the issue of independence movements is the only thing I can see that addresses that you get rid of the party system, that you as a people rise up and say that we're changing things fundamentally within the mechanisms that are legally available, which I don't think any existing party will do.
That could well be so. Yeah. But if, let's put it this way, and politics is not my expertise, so anybody feel free to disagree with me, but if you had that kind of a population, a kind of an opinion in the population, and as a budding politician, you understood that population would vote for you if you promised to do what it is that they wanted to do, and you would stay in power to do it if you did it properly, then in theory, that's the way it's supposed to work. So I can only conclude that right now, not enough of the Canadian population actually wants fundamental change. They like to vote for what they know.
Okay, we have 3 hands up. I'm going to cut it off at that, and I'm going to try very hard to make sure we don't go more than 15 minutes over time, so to 8:45. So, Michael, you're up. Please unmute, Michael.
Thank you. It's certainly an interesting discussion. Most of our discussion has kind of kept us in the box of the courts, colonial courts. I think obviously we need to look at history and realize that the colonials have only been here a short period of time. Now, a question which I'll preface with this, there are 2 Supreme Court of Canada decisions, Revue de Sautel 2021, as well as what was, I'm trying to see the reference here. It was another case between BC and Haida, not more than a year or 2 ago. The bottom line was both in those decisions of the Supreme Court basically said that on unceded land, unconquered people, without treaty, then the Indigenous common law, if you want to call it that, which is a legal term, would be then deemed to be continuing. In the case of Haida, I believe that was a major point, is that they had a right to govern themselves under their own law, and the courts would be subject to the rulings of their own tribal tribunals. So not to get into the details because we don't have time, but with those kind of decisions actually coming out of the Supreme Court, why are the courts not opening up their brain to what is true history? Because the true history would suggest that before colonial times, the Crown, in fact, had provided royal decrees guaranteeing the sovereignty of particularly the BC tribal nations. Call it the Coast Salish, Interior Salish. And that's fact. So why are we not opening up the greater discussion there?
Well, my first thought, and the other two gents on the panel may have more to add than I do, but my first response to that is that those you may be alluding to the Royal Proclamation of 1763 in part, and that document is the source of a lot of trouble because it's not really clear what it means. But the one thing it does not say is sovereignty. So that the presumption in that Royal Proclamation, as I read it, is that, and this is the British Crown at the time. The British Crown at the time was claiming sovereignty over the territory. This is including in the United States. It would basically reflect the idea. This is the monarch saying, I am the monarch over this land. Here's what I don't want you to do. I don't want you to displace the Aboriginals that you find in their hunting grounds. That's one of the phrases that it uses in the proclamation. Okay, that's a long way from sovereignty. It's not a nation to nation thing. It's telling your own subjects, don't abuse those people. Leave them alone. That's all. Now, that's not exactly the way the courts have interpreted it. But my point is, it doesn't mean this, doesn't mean that. And who the heck knows what it means?
Sorry, yeah, Erica, Lisa, if you can just unmute Michael and let him finish a couple more words, and then we'll move on to Barb.
Sorry, I guess I was muted. No, my point simply says that according to their own colonial laws, they have no right to enforce their own laws on unconquered peoples. They are occupying the land.
That's not true.
A military law.
That's just not true. That's not true. There's all kinds of decisions of the courts that have basically said that
the courts have said that they're not conquered.
The general laws.
If they're not conquered, and if they haven't got a treaty, then what right have they got?
The law is what the courts do, and what the courts do is apply the general laws of the country and the province to everywhere in the province, as long as it's not interfering with some duty of consultation, for example.
Sure, but only rightfully on their subjects, who are not
true.
Sovereign originals.
Not true. Aboriginal peoples are subject.
They never conquered. Oh well, but only if they were conquered by war or treated.
Yeah,
and that's a fact.
You are begging the question, right? This is the awkward political.
We need to address that.
I agree with you about that. So here is the awkward political problem. Nobody wants to say Aboriginal people were conquered, but the alternative story is, well, they didn't cede the land, so therefore they own all of BC. Look, is there anything in between those two things? I don't know. I take your point.
Well, I'll just make a final comment and go on and yield, but I want to make a point here that, I think the fear and the real enemy here is the UN. The original peoples, if we want to, that's what I would call it. First Nations are a part of that. They basically gave up their rights and sovereignty to the first, the Indian Affairs Act. But my simple point is that they're a peaceful people. They want peace, love, and harmony. They're not looking to take people's property. They're looking to be better stewards of the land and provide a better way. That's an alternative that we should look at and welcome.
Doesn't that depend?
The problem here is that
doesn't that depend upon the person you're talking about?
Well, possibly, but within UNDRIP, there are articles that open up a door for the opportunity to take some governance, particularly if you're hereditary. But I simply want to make the point that if under legal contract, which means that now we're subject to colonial or British Admiralty law, they've given up their right, and they're now under the terms and conditions of what is a trust agreement that is
Okay,
an
wait,
UNDRIP
so
agreement.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but okay, now, okay, you've shown your,
That
you've
you
shown
see
your
where
hand.
it then would revert
Hold
back
on,
to the
hold on,
UN.
hold
And
on. You've shown your hand.
that's the
You're
problem.
talking about admiralty law. This is one of those things that doesn't count in the courts. You're talking about a.
Well, no, I'm talking about the UN. I want to focus on the UN and UNDRIP and the danger.
The
Okay,
UN
we're
is
gonna move on because this is
the
getting way too
UN.
complicated.
Let me just finish this. I thought.
Yeah,
the
yeah.
the UN is just a place for countries to meet and make their deals. Yeah, it's a bureaucracy, but it has no independent power except for the indirect power it can influence its leaders to behave in a certain way. Formally, the UN has no power at all except that power that countries give to it.
Great, thanks. And Barb, you can go ahead.
Yes, I just have a quick question. As a landowner, somebody who's paid their entire life for a piece of property that they think they call their own.
Yep.
If I have a First Nations person come and ask me for taxes, and you guys say that we would have to pay extra taxes as well as our provincial property taxes or municipal property taxes, what if I couldn't pay them? And or what if they decided they wanted my particular piece of property for who knows what reason? Aren't they displacing me? And doesn't that just repeat the harms that have been done throughout the ages? And what kind of financial recourse would I have in that case to get reimbursed for the hardship that I'm now facing?
Good questions. Very good questions. The answer is yes, we all go around in circles. You would have very little recourse if we're talking about a piece of land, this piece of land that you have, if that, for example, was on Haida Gwaii, then the situation you're describing could very well turn out that way, and you would probably have no recourse at all. And I take your point, and that's not the way it ought to be, but that's where we're going.
Thanks, Bruce. Okay, we're going to move to Rima, and that'll be our last one. Rima needs to be unmuted. And again.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for offering me the opportunity to speak. Very, very important, interesting conversation. I urge everyone to go to preventgenocide2030.org. There you will find on the homepage a legal memo that documents clearly that the United Nations, as Bruce has just said, as a private club, and that's all it is, as a private club, is not an agency or organization or state that can enter into a treaty obligation with any country. As a private club, under the Vienna Conference Treaty on the Law of the Vienna Conference on the Law of Treaties, 1961 and 69, treaties can only be made between equivalent sovereign states. Consequently, anything that the United Nations says we have to do, whether we as Canada, the United States, Cambodia, Vietnam, or Vanuatu, is nonsense. A country can choose to do what it likes, but it is not bound by treaty obligations to an unelected nobody's club, which is what the United Nations is. First point. Second point, the United States, which is still important geopolitically, has before its Congress two bills. One is H.R. 6645 in the House of Representatives, and the other is S3428 before the Senate. Together, they are called the Disengaging Entirely from the United Nations Debacle Act of 2030. It is critically important, in my view, that the United States pass this act in both houses with a sufficient majority to override the inevitable veto that the Oval Office will give it, so that the United States can, in fact, withdraw from the UN and all of its bits and pieces. The WHO is a subsidiary for-profit corporation that serves the UN, as does as do all of the other bits and pieces of the UN. But the UN is absolutely a declared death machine. And through one stratagem or another, killing agriculture, and by the way, it is officially linked through two agreements with the World Economic Forum, which has just come out asking the governments of the world to destroy all the bees on the planet because bees are bad for the climate. Right? We're talking about insanity. So this organization has been a depopulation and global control organization from its inception. It wasn't taken over by bad people. It was created by bad people. And it is doing what it was designed to do. From my point of view,
I'm just going to interrupt here. I appreciate
let me just
knowing
finish
what
one
you're
sentence.
telling us about the
it is essential to
US
leave
situation,
that organization,
but
it is true
I
for
would like to
Canada
contain the
as
conversation
well.
to what we're talking about right now.
It
And
is
we've
true
got
for
4
Canada
minutes
as
left.
well.
It
is
yes.
true for Canada as well. And UNDRIP is simply part of the manipulation to destroy the country, its people, its population.
Agreed. UNDRIP is part of a complicated mechanism. And thank you for your information. I do think there's stuff going on in the US that is so related to what's going on here by a different name that it would be great to have a discussion on that in the future. So before we close, I just want to ask our speakers one by one. Do you, Bruce, have anything else you'd like to add that we haven't covered or leave the audience with?
There's lots we haven't covered, but I don't think I want to go into those things. I guess if I could leave with a parting thought, it is still that for all the bad things that the UN is involved in, and I don't disagree, our problem is still our own leaders. And we do have the capacity to do what is necessary, like in terms of getting them out of office. If we are able to muster that kind of action, and that kind of action is entirely politically legitimate. And so I don't want us to go off chasing wild gooses elsewhere, because the real problem is the inclination of our own governments, both elected and unelected, to manage us. And their management doesn't work. It's totally off the rails. It's a form of cultural destruction, if I can put it that way. But these are our own people who have gone off the straight and narrow. So it needs to be fixed.
Thanks. Jeffrey.
No, I agree with that. It is good to focus on our problems, what we can do, and our governments are the ones doing the problems. Any member state can leave the UN whenever it wants to. The UN, just clarify a few things about treaties and so on with the UN. The UN usually sets up bodies or agencies, and they will draft treaties and then they'll administer treaties, but they usually are not a party to the treaty. They're administering the treaties. And people can join the treaty, they can lead the treaty. Countries are still, even though there are many players and actors trying to reduce national sovereignty, sovereign nation states are still the name of the game. Sovereignty is still with the nation states, and we can still get out of this mess just using our own powers. That's all we need. I just add that.
Very good, thank you. Joshua.
I'm not a political kind of guy, but there are so many politicians who are incentivized to follow a specific direction. It worries me to think that anyone in political or federal politics seem to follow a route that is contrary to the will of the people, the desires that somebody represent them, that will follow. For me, of course, it's about the heart of honesty and truth. And it's hard to have to deal with that. I think that in our relationships, we need to gather together as individuals and groups to either prepare to be together, help each other in any kind of community, to resolve our issues with what's happening politically by being a community. And I think that, you know, as they have said, you know, when you're doing things in a community way, it affects you not only within your area, but also globally and within the country, and that we can do something collectively that will make a difference, you know, throughout the different nations we're in. I really want to thank you, Maureen, and all the people that have helped out with putting this together, with Erica and Randy and Lisa and you know, notTV. Thanks for putting this on and for making this accessible to so many, and the many conversations you and I have had and others. And thank you so much, Bruce and Jeffrey, for coming on and sharing your wisdom and doing what you do. It's much appreciated.
Thank you, Joshua. Yes, thank you to all three of you for giving your time again and you know, really going deep into some of these questions. And it's just apparent how much thought and concern and confusion there is out there. And just thanks for that. Thank you to the audience for your thoughts and your questions and for being with us tonight. And as Joshua said, thank you so much to the BC Rising folks, Erica, Lisa, Randy. Thank you to Travis at notTV, to Maya for running one of our live streams. We could not do this without you. So I hope that people got something out of tonight. I know I sure did. And we hope to do another one again soon. And I just wish you a good night. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.